What's the creepiest thing that you ever experienced? Story 1. When I was 10 years old, I ended up home alone for the night when my parents were stuck in another city because the trains were not operating. For me, it was pretty exciting. It meant I could stay up all night and play Mario Kart in my room. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, I thought I could hear something, so I pressed mute on the television and heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I had not heard any doors open, and I knew my parents were out of town, and my brother was staying at his girlfriend's house. He was 16 or 17 years old. So right then I began to panic. I literally could not move at all with fear of making a noise. Anyway, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and a door slammed a few seconds later. Frozen in my bed, I texted my brother to make sure it was not him, and he replied that he was at the girlfriend's house. I texted my parents, basically telling them that I thought there was someone in the house and asking whether I should call the police. My mother called me right after that, wanting to know what was going on. She realized how serious I was when I could barely whisper, and she told me to get out of the house and call the police. I crept out of my room and heard a voice in my brother's room. I listened, and it was definitely his voice, which left me extremely confused. Still on the phone with my mother, I slowly opened his door in 3 seconds of epic suspense. I later found out that my brother had thought I was out of town with my parents, so he brought his girlfriend back to our house so they could spend the night together. To cut the story short, I walked into his room while they were in a very private moment, and I witnessed more than I ever wanted to while my mother was still frantically speaking to me on the phone. Story 2. When we were 9 or 10 years old, a friend and I were riding our bikes around the parking lot of the local ice skating rink one summer. The rink was closed for the season and sat off a highway in a kind of wooded area. We came around the side of the building and saw a man in a tan van. Not a creepy serial killer type van, but the kind that had captain's chairs in the back, sometimes with a little table inside. They were kind of popular in the 1980s. He called out to us to come over to him, so we rode up to the van. He told us one of his tires had a slow leak and he needed us to help him change it. He already had an extra tire leaning against the side of the van and said he was not strong enough to get the lug nuts off by himself. He asked us to go around to the other side of the van, open the sliding door, and get a wrench from the floorboard inside. My friend got off his bike and started to walk to the other side, but to me something just seemed really strange about the situation. I did not know why. I was just really uncomfortable. So I told the man we would go get our parents and come back to help him. He looked kind of surprised and pleaded with us to just help him for a few minutes, but we just rode off on our bikes. We got home, ran inside, and told my dad what happened. He about lost it, grabbed one of his pistols, loaded us in the car, and we drove back down to the skating rink. The man and the van were gone. It scared me badly enough that I can still remember his face 20 years later. Story 3. When I was about 7 years old, my family lived in a house about 50 yards from a river. We had a neighbor down the street we nicknamed Crazy Larry because he was an alcoholic and always did really strange things. For example, he once spent a short time in jail after bragging at a bar that he could shoot down President Bush's helicopter from his house since we lived near Crawford, and he would get arrested for driving under the influence all the time. My 3 brothers and I were swimming in the river one afternoon while my parents were inside. They did not really need to watch us since we had grown up there and were perfectly capable of swimming, and my 11-year-old brother was with us, plus we were in a shallow area. The river's about 100 yards from one side to the other, and we were in the middle. Crazy Larry showed up from out of nowhere and started swimming toward us, yelling that he was going to drown each of us one by one. We started throwing rocks at him and yelling for help. A younger neighbor was outside and we kept asking him to go get our parents, but he was slow to understand the urgency. After about 10 minutes of relentless rock throwing, with Larry getting closer and closer, my dad finally saw us. He jumped into the river, swam over to Larry, threw several punches, and told him not to come near us again. Larry went home and we called the police shortly afterward. They picked him up for driving under the influence as he was passing our house with the police still there. It was definitely a strange day. Story 4. In 5th grade, my parents left town and somehow wound up leaving me with the family of a kid from my school I only somewhat knew. I did know that this kid was kind of wild but friendly enough. After school on Friday, the adventure began when he showed me that I would sleep on a couch in the family room. We did normal kid stuff until his mother and father came home upset because an uncle in from out of town had just died that day on the couch I was to be sleeping on. His parents left for another relative's house to deal with the death, leaving us and his older twin brother and sister in the house for pretty much the entire weekend, with a few exceptions. The rest of the weekend is a blur of absolute chaos, but two events still rank among the most disturbing things I have ever seen. The first event was when his older sister came home intoxicated with two little kittens. She told me their names were Pink and Floyd and said they would grow up together. A few hours later, my friend and I were playing somewhere in the house when we heard yelling and commotion downstairs. The dad came home angry and had flipped out about the cats. My friend came back to tell me that his dad was furious and had gone into the backyard to punish the sister by getting rid of the kittens. When I realized what was happening, I ran back there to see one kitten thrown out wet and lifeless across the grass and the other one being pulled out of a box. I blurted out that my mom had really wanted a kitten and that I would take him back to my parents' house right then, just to make him stop. He shrugged and handed me the kitten. Unfortunately, I did not actually have any keys to my house, so for the rest of the weekend, we hid it in a filing cabinet in the garage, giving it water and food regularly. We had that cat for 21 years. The second event was what happened after the kids sneaked into a bedroom they were renting to a boarder and stole a movie from his closet to watch. The only video player was in the parents' bedroom, so we loaded it up there, sitting on the foot of their bed. The sister and brother came home and found us in there. They teased us a little, then sat on the bed behind us, making comments about the movie. At one point, some actress was on the screen, and the kid's brother behind me said something inappropriate about his sister's appearance. My friend turned and laughed, nudging me to look, and I noticed they were acting way too close for comfort. I just turned back around and eventually eased away. I was also on an elementary school shuttle bus in third grade that was involved in a minor fender bender. The other driver, a drunk security guard in uniform, attacked my driver when they went out to talk about it. The bus driver hitchhiked away down the freeway, and I never saw him again. We had a new driver about every week. It was a really bad bus company. The security guard proceeded to threaten us through the glass with a fake badge and demand to be let on the bus. We barricaded ourselves inside while an older kid radioed for help on the bus radio. We also threw cookies down at the security guard, which infuriated him. Eventually, the police came, and we had to wait for a new bus to take us to school. Story 5, I was 11 years old at the time, and my mom had this creepy, old-fashioned, life-size doll. It was about 2 feet tall and ran on batteries, which made it talk whenever you squeezed its palm. She kept it stored in a hall closet for a long time. One day I was home alone watching television when I heard a noise coming from the hall. It was the doll in the closet talking. I was confused as to why it had suddenly started speaking. I thought maybe it had fallen over and pressed its own button, making it talk. Well, it would not stop, so I reached around to its back compartment to pull out the batteries. There was this odd, empty feeling, and to my dismay, there were no batteries. I flipped it around to make sure. No batteries. It was talking with no power source at all. After a second of being frozen in fear, the creepiness pouring over me, I gathered my courage in the name of reason, grabbed the doll, dashed to a window, and threw it outside as hard as I could. I sat curled up under a blanket until my mom came home. Story 6, I have a very vivid imagination, as in there is probably something a bit unusual about it. When I get tired, I can wind up having mild hallucinations. If I am really tired, I can experience both visual and auditory ones. Nothing frightening, mostly mundane, often just random phrases, but I know it is all in my head. I know it is just parts of my brain shutting down while the rest stays awake. I have even fallen asleep while being completely conscious. It is like my body shuts off and I am trapped inside my mind thinking, oh no, not this again. At least there is music playing, so I can tell how long this lasts. When I was a kid, I had no idea what was happening to me. I thought it was real. I thought everyone went through this. I would fall halfway asleep and end up trapped in a kind of half-lucid nightmare. It was like my brain had not quite figured out how to dream properly, like it was reading the manual and skipping around randomly. I would be awake and dreaming at the same time. I would feel things standing on me, pushing me, poking me. Sometimes I felt like I could not breathe. I would wake up paralyzed. I would hear voices, the voices of people I knew, my parents and strangers. That was not the creepy part. The creepy part was one dream I remember from when I was around 9 or 10 years old. It was the first time I ever had a truly surreal experience. I woke up in the morning as usual, and everything seemed real. I could touch and smell things, but there were no people. My parents were gone. All the normal sounds of life cars passing, laughter, distant chatter were gone. The world was covered in a cottony silence. My room was smaller and had less furniture. All my toys were gone. There were posters on the wall. I looked out my window, and instead of the fence that was always there was an open field full of wheat. A voice told me that everything was gone, that I had just dreamed it all, that it was time to wake up. The dream logic made complete sense to me. I believed, even if for a moment, that my whole life, all 10 years of it, had been imaginary. I felt sad. My parents had never existed. My friends, my school, everything was make-believe. I had never felt so alone. It felt worse than being abandoned. Then I woke up. It was the first time I had ever woken up in real life and felt like I was still dreaming. I did not trust my senses. Everything had felt real in the dream, and everything felt real now. How could I tell the difference? I remember being terrified of opening my window, afraid the fence would not be there. When I heard my dad snoring, I finally felt safe. The dream world had no sound except that disembodied voice. Story 7. A while back, my family and some family friends would go on a trip once a year up in the mountains, where we would rent a cabin by a river. Back then, my friends and I used to ride dirt bikes all the time, and the cabin was located on land where you could ride straight out into the woods from the front door. My friend's dad was a firefighter and had once been an A-class, semi-professional endurance rider. One day we decided to ride as far as we could to check out what was beyond the Alpine Ridge. We got out there, and there was nothing too special, just a few areas of forest cleared by some logging company. Anyway, as we started heading back through the trees, we took a path that led us into a small valley clearing. But there was something strange, a silver streamlined trailer, one of those one-room campers that looked like it came from the future. Curious, we rode toward it. As we came around the side, we found ourselves staring at a man dressed like a waiter or butler, standing perfectly still in a tuxedo with a towel draped over his arm. In front of him was a small circular table covered with a red tablecloth, a silver candlestick with a lit candle, and a full table setting. Plates, forks, knives, spoons, extra utensils, the whole setup. And in his other hand, he held a bottle of wine with the neck broken. Needless to say, my friend's dad shouted for us to go, and being already terrified by such a bizarre sight, we took off immediately. We talked about it for a long time afterward and still have no idea how that trailer got there or what that man was doing. Maybe some wealthy people were planning a helicopter dinner in the middle of nowhere. Who knows? It remains the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. Story 8. When I was around 5 years old, my family visited the Federal Bureau of Investigation building in Washington, District of Columbia. We went on a tour of the building, which included several stops to browse items on display and look around. My 2 brothers were there, along with my mom and dad. We were a young family at the time. As the tour went on, a man kept staying close to us, specifically near me and my 7-year-old brother. He offered to play tic-tac-toe while we waited and generally made everyone uncomfortable. Soon, others in the group noticed and asked my parents if he was with us because they found it strange. My mother later said it felt like a living nightmare. Every move we made, he followed. Everything happened in slow motion. Being 5, I blurted out that I needed to use the restroom. My mom, overwhelmed, said no, she could not take me right then. That is when the man stepped in and said, "I will take your kids to the bathroom for you." My mother froze with fear, not wanting to start a confrontation. Suddenly, a black woman wearing an FBI tour uniform took my hand and said, "I will take him to the bathroom." Right then, security rushed in. Word had gotten out that the man had been acting suspiciously. The woman took me to the restroom, while officers detained him for questioning. Later, they got him to admit that he had intended to kidnap me. I do not know what other evidence they had, but it was enough to press charges, and my parents were given the option to do so. They chose not to, and they still regret that decision to this day. We wanted to thank the woman from the tour and asked if we could speak to her. No one by her name or description worked there. My mom believes she was an angel. Story 9. A couple of years ago, I was living in a shared house with some older guys. I was probably 19 at the time, and my roommates were 26, 30, and 40, so they all had full-time jobs. Since I only worked part-time, I would often get the house to myself during the day. One morning, I had just woken up and was lying in bed for a bit before getting up around 10 o'clock when I heard this loud banging, like bang, 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 with short pauses in between. I figured it was probably someone doing construction work nearby, but it was incredibly loud. After about a minute of this constant pounding, I got annoyed, got out of bed, and started walking toward the front door to see what was going on. Then I heard it again, bang, bang, and realized the sound was shaking the frame of the house. I looked at the door and saw the wood splintering around the handle. That is when it hit me. Someone was trying to break in. The banging continued as I stood there, half-dressed and terrified, realizing the door was about to shatter. I started shouting, "What is going on?" at the top of my lungs. The banging suddenly stopped, and I heard footsteps running away. Peeking through the window, I saw 3 men in hoodies running off, probably in their mid-20s. I reported it to the police, and the officer who came by said 1 or 2 more kicks, and they would have been inside. Story 10. I once knew a man named Jim. Jim was a landlord who ran a small village pub with his wife Betty. They were a wonderful couple, always happy to see the locals and welcoming to strangers. The beer was always fresh, the crisps were always in date, and the beer mats were always spotless. They were the perfect pair to run a village pub. Sadly, Betty developed cancer some years ago, and after a short battle, she passed away. Jim was devastated and spent the next few weeks inconsolable. He could barely function, and the pub that he had once run like a well-oiled machine began to fall apart. The concerned locals banded together to help and raised a few £100, which, for such a small village, was remarkable. With the money, they bought him a black Labrador puppy. When we presented the dog to Jim, he was visibly moved. He had always kept dogs before marrying Betty, but she was allergic to their hair, so he had not been able to have one for nearly 30 years. He quickly grew attached to Lucy, as he named her, taking her out for walks in the nearby woods at every opportunity. We would often see him and Lucy sitting by the stream, peacefully enjoying each other's company. Having Lucy around changed Jim's outlook on life again. The pub returned to its cheerful state, and we were all relieved to see him polishing the brass fixtures, changing the drip trays, and measuring drinks with his old enthusiasm. For the next 4 years, every night when the bell rang for last orders, everyone knew Jim was in good company with Lucy watching over him. Then the accident happened. Jim was returning from his evening walk with Lucy one night after closing time, as always. He noticed a car speeding down the narrow country lane, but Lucy was distracted by a squirrel she had spotted. Jim shouted for her, but she did not respond. She ran into the road and the car came around the bend, striking her and killing her instantly. Once again, the locals faced a heartbreaking situation. Jim was so distraught that we thought we might try to preserve Lucy's memory in some way. Sadly, the accident had been so severe that the only part of her body that remained intact was her tail. Being country folk, we did not think it strange to have just the tail preserved, so we asked a taxidermist to mount Lucy's tail on a wooden stand. This somewhat morbid keepsake was presented to Jim, who seemed deeply touched by the gesture. At first, everything seemed fine. Jim went back to running the pub as usual, and we were all glad to see him recovering. But after a few weeks, he began acting distracted. He would often glance up at the tail, which was mounted above the door. The regular customers noticed that he spent as much time staring at it as he did serving drinks. One evening, he called me over and whispered, "That tail, it's haunted." I was stunned. Jim, my lifelong friend and the most sensible man I knew, talking about ghosts? I laughed at first, but his serious expression told me he meant it. He said, "Every night since that thing went up, right after the stroke of 11 o'clock, I hear a dreadful howling. It's Lucy, I know it. The noise gets louder and louder until I take the tail down." I wanted to hear it for myself. After the last customers left that night, we waited. Sure enough, as the clock struck 11, a terrible wailing filled the pub. The glasses rattled on the shelves as the sound grew louder and louder. Jim turned to me and quietly said, "I think I know what the problem is." Lucy had been buried in the woods near the road where she died. Jim took the tale down and asked me to come with him. We walked together through the dark, me carrying a flashlight and Jim carrying Lucy's tale on its wooden stand. It would have looked ridiculous to anyone else, but it was late and no one was around. We reached the small clearing where she was buried. The grave was still visible, though covered in leaves and branches. Jim asked me to hold the tale while he began digging. He dug until we heard a soft thud as the shovel hit the wooden box. He lifted the casket out and brushed away the dirt. The inscription read, "My beloved Lucy, faithful companion, dearly missed, Jim." As he knelt there, we heard the same eerie howling echo through the woods. "She wants her tale," he said. I nodded, unable to believe what was happening. "I can't do it," he said. The howling grew louder. "Look, Jim," I told him, "if that really is Lucy, it won't stop until you put the tale back with her." He looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered, "I want to, but I can't." "Why not?" I asked. He looked at me gravely and replied, "Because it's illegal to retail spirits after 11 o'clock. Story 11. One year my entire family gathered for Thanksgiving at a relative's house in Arizona. Because it was a small house, many of us had to sleep on the floor, so my brother and I were in the television room. The rest of the adults and the women from my aunt's group home for people with developmental disabilities were in other rooms. They were like part of the family. Most of them were over 50 years old but had the minds of young children. I woke up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard scratching noises. As I lay there in the dark, the sounds became clearer. They shifted from scratching to shuffling, then to harsh scraping that moved around the edge of the room. I thought one of the dogs had somehow gotten in, so I was not too worried at first. But then I realized the breathing did not sound like a dog or like a person. I felt tugging on the blanket near my feet. Right then, my brother woke up and screamed. Within seconds, my mom and aunt burst into the room and flipped on the lights. One of my aunt's residents was crouched in the corner like an animal. When the lights came on, she made a chilling half scream, half growl, half hiss sound, and bolted from the room on all fours. I have never seen a 60-year-old woman move that way. She left deep scratches in the hardwood floor where she had been digging. Story 12. My father passed away when I was 4, so it was just me and my mother living at home. One night in early 1982, when I was 6 years old, there was a knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning. My mother got up to answer it, and I followed because I had heard it too. My mother called out, "Who is it?" And a man's voice responded, "I'm looking for Mrs. Stipasan. Open the door." We have an unusual family name, but it is nothing like that, so my mother immediately became cautious and afraid. The man kept knocking, growing angrier as she refused to open the door. He started kicking and shouting, threatening to break the windows. We did not have a phone to call the police, so my mother switched to plan B. She turned on loud music, hoping to wake the neighbors and scare him away. It worked. A neighbor from across the street came over to complain about the noise after the man ran off. When my mom explained what had happened, he went to call the police. The next day, the officers brought a locksmith to install extra locks and a panic button. Years later, when I was a teenager, my mother told me that the officer's face had gone pale when she gave her statement. He told her we needed better security right away. It turned out they were looking for someone who targeted vulnerable households like ours. They never told her what exactly he had done, but the implication was clear. During the incident, my mother had a cleaver in one hand and a can of oven cleaner in the other. If the man had broken in, he would have been blinded or worse. My mother is not the kind of person to go down without a fight. Story 13. The first thing you should know is that my house is 130 years old and spent 110 of those years as a funeral home. It looks exactly like the kind of haunted house you imagine. The basement is unfinished, with leaky pipes, jagged stone walls, and a dirt floor. The old mortuary room down there is the only one with wooden walls, but flooding over the years has rotted them. In the center of that room sits a single rusted metal chair that moves around occasionally, and I still have no idea how. When I was 16, I decided I wanted my own room, so I moved into the attic apartment. I lasted about 3 months. The problem was that a girl who had been dying of multiple sclerosis had taken her own life there in 1975. Every night when I tried to sleep, I would see her standing there, telling me to get out. I tried sleeping with the light on, but every night I had nightmares of her trying to harm me, and when I woke up, the light was off. I thought it was all psychological, that if I stuck it out, it would stop. It didn't. Eventually, I gave up and started sleeping on the couch in what used to be the viewing room. That room has a window with a bullet hole in it and a player piano that sometimes plays by itself. When I was little, I once went into the kitchen for a drink and saw a black shadow shaped like a person coming out of the basement. I froze, trying to scream, but nothing came out. The shadow walked halfway toward me, then turned around and went back down the stairs. When I was in 5th grade, lightning struck a 120-year-old tree in the yard. It should have crashed through the one-story section of the house where I was standing, but somehow it bounced off. In 7th grade, at 2 in the morning, bricks from the chimney collapsed and crushed the heating vent, causing carbon monoxide to fill the house. Somehow my dad woke my mom, and got us out just in time. There is also a 300-year-old tree outside that bats live in, and a few years back, several of them started flying directly into a window until it shattered so they could get inside. Once, while removing a ceiling to set up cables for the television, dead mice fell on me. Another time, while I was home alone, my family was away in Niagara Falls. I woke up to the sound of a gunfight outside. I hid under the covers with my dog barking nonstop until everything went quiet. The next morning, police arrived and carried a body bag out of a house across the street. If the shots had gone a little differently, I might not have been found for days. Story 14. When I was in middle school, my family moved into a neighborhood in Florida that bordered a swampy cypress forest. Our house sat about 50 yards back into the woods, so it was not unusual for 4-inch wolf spiders to wander inside. As someone terrified of spiders, every encounter was horrifying, but one night remains burned into my memory. I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason and stared at the ceiling. In the dim light from the porch, I could make out a dark shape directly above me. Without thinking, I rolled out of bed and turned on the nightstand light just in time to see a massive wolf spider fall from the ceiling and land squarely on my pillow. I barely slept after that. Another terrifying memory involved my oldest friend, Aaron. He lived a few blocks away and had a creek in his backyard. If you followed the creek downstream, it passed under a road through 3 large pipes about 4 feet wide and 100 feet long. The dark, algae-covered tunnels looked like something out of a monster movie. Of course, being adventurous kids, we decided to crawl through one instead of walking over the road. I went first, determined to reach the light at the other end, our nervous laughter echoing inside. Halfway through, I realized only my voice was echoing. Aaron had turned back. Terrified, I splashed forward, shouting his name until I shot out the other end and saw him waiting there, grinning. I was furious, but only for a moment. Kids pull stunts like that. A few years later, he even saved me from drowning in the dumbest way possible in an above-ground pool. Love that guy. Story 15. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, my older brother and I were home alone in the morning. Our parents had already left for work, and we were waiting for our separate school buses. It was the first year our schedules were different. He was in junior high, so he left earlier. At the time, our house was undergoing an addition, so it was normal for construction workers to show up early. They usually let themselves in or went around to the back, calling out to announce their arrival. That day, though, we had been told no one was supposed to come. As I was getting ready to leave, I walked past the basement stairs on my way to the mudroom when I heard a loud voice call out, "Hello?" It sounded distant, maybe outside. I figured a worker had arrived unexpectedly, so I checked the front window but saw no vehicles. Sometimes they parked at the bottom of our long, steep driveway, so I was not too concerned. I went to the front door, calling out, "Hello, I'm here," and opened it. No one was there. Confused, I locked it and went to the back of the house where the work was being done. I called out again, no response. I shrugged it off, assuming I had imagined the deep voice, and went back to grab my coat and shoes for school. As I passed the basement stairs again, I suddenly heard a cluster of whispers, at least 3 different voices, And then one clear voice said, "She's leaving." I froze for a split second, then did the only thing I could. Threw on my coat, slipped into my shoes, and ran out the door as fast as I possibly could. Story 16. When I was about 7 years old, my parents bought a house in the Johnson Lane area of Minden, Nevada. There were 5 kids in the family, and the house was a 4-bedroom, 2-story home. My baby sister slept in my parents' room upstairs. My oldest brother had the downstairs room. My older sister had one of the upstairs rooms, and my other brother had the remaining one. That left me without a bedroom. The house had a strange floor plan, and behind the western wall of my brother's upstairs room, there was a large 8-foot space between the interior and exterior walls. The space had no door, only a small octagonal window, like a stop sign that faced west toward the Sierra Nevada mountains in the setting sun. My dad decided to knock out the wall between that space and my brother's room, install saloon doors, and let my mom paint murals of Snoopy and Charlie Brown on the walls. Voila! I had my own little room that I entered through my brother's. Because of the odd shape of the space and the steeply slanted roof, the only vertical wall was the one with the window, so I slept with my bed beneath it. I could never figure out why there had been a window into a space that wasn't accessible. One night when I was about 8, I dreamed that I was levitating. I woke suddenly and, for a second, could have sworn I was lying at a right angle to the window, with only my shoulders on the bed and the rest of me suspended horizontally in the air toward the saloon doors. I could have sworn I stayed like that for a full second before gravity kicked in and I fell to the floor. It terrified me. Story 17. When my brother and I were little, we spent summers with our maternal grandparents. One year when we were 6 and 7, it was a cold, rainy night, and our grandfather was working in the forest far outside the small hamlet where we lived. That meant our grandmother had to go down into the dirt basement to light the wood-burning furnace to heat the tiny 2-bedroom house. My brother and I sat in the kitchen playing Go Fish while waiting for her to return so we could switch to gin rummy. She had been gone for quite a while when we suddenly heard her voice, thin and high-pitched, calling, "Help! Help! Chris and Troy, help me!" We shouted back, "What is it, Grandma? What's wrong?" Her voice came again, "Help me! They've got me!" We froze. "Who's got you, Grandma?" we asked. "The vampires! They've got me!" she cried. Terrified, we ran to the basement door and looked down the rickety ladder that served as the only way in or out. It was pitch black down there. The only light usually came from the flashlight or lantern someone carried, but her lantern wasn't on. We hesitated, scared of the dark and whatever had taken her. Then we heard her again, calling for help. There was no one else to turn to, so we grabbed a flashlight, hearts pounding, and carefully climbed down. At the bottom, we huddled together, shining the light around the stacks of firewood. "Grandma, where are you? Are you okay?" we called, but there was no response. We crept farther in, searching behind the furnace and the wood piles, but she was nowhere. Finally, we decided to go upstairs, grab our coats, and run down the hill to get a relative from the bar to help. When we climbed back up and stepped into the kitchen, shaken and out of breath, we saw our grandmother sitting calmly at the table like nothing had happened. When we asked her what was going on, she looked at us as if we were imagining things and asked whether we were ready to play cards or go to bed. Years later, I found out that before we arrived that summer, they had dug a small crawl space exit at the back of the cellar that wasn't visible at night. Turns out Grandma had slipped out that way and circled back into the house to play a prank on us. She laughed about it for years afterward. It wasn't her first family trick. My grandmother was a mischievous prankster, and she passed that talent down to her children. Story 18. When I was around 16 years old, my mother and father started working different shifts. In the early morning hours, my younger brother and I were left alone for a few hours until it was time to leave for school. We lived in a quiet area without many neighbors, and the nights were always still. One morning, while it was still dark, my brother woke me up, terrified, saying he had seen a hand knocking on his window while a strange voice whispered, "Let me in, please. I know your parents aren't home, little boy." I thought he was having a nightmare, but then I heard laughter outside and my blood ran cold. At that time, I was a troubled teenager and had secretly bought a 9mm handgun from someone. By the end of this story, you'll understand why that decision made a twisted kind of sense. I decided this might be the moment I would need it. This was before cell phones, and the only house phone was across the hall near several large windows. We also lived about 10 minutes from the nearest police station, so if anything happened, help would arrive too late. I told my brother to hide in the bathroom while I retrieved the gun. Just as I started toward his room, I saw a hand wave across my window, and the voice came again saying, "Please let me in. I'm hurt. I know your father, and he said I should be your friend." My heart was pounding, but I stepped out and shouted, "Then come in, the front door is unlocked." I turned on the porch light, hoping the brightness would intimidate whoever it was into leaving. From where I stood, I had a clear view of the front door and thought I could surprise him if he tried to enter. I heard footsteps on the porch. The doorknob turned and the man said again, "Help, I'm hurt," in that same eerie voice. My hands were shaking as I aimed the gun at the door. Then through the light, I saw his watch and recognized it. It was my dad. I dropped the gun and shouted, "Are you serious? You have a key. You didn't have to wake us up like that." My brother came out of the bathroom as our dad burst out laughing. He had gotten off work early and decided to test how we would react if someone tried to break in while our parents were away. Story 19. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my friends and I used to ride our bikes deep into the woods near our neighborhood. We built forts, played cowboys, and explored dirt trails that went on for miles. It was the 1980s, and apparently no one thought twice about kids roaming that far from home unsupervised. One afternoon, we were several miles out, well past the neighborhood, and into the edge of a large state park, when two men on white-painted all-terrain vehicles sped past us down the trail. They were dressed entirely in white, and my little kid brain thought they must be painters headed to work on something in the woods. Curious, we decided to follow their tracks to see what they were doing. We came to a small ridge that blocked our view, but we could hear voices beyond it. We crept up the hill, peered over the top, and froze. Below us, about 20 men dressed in white robes were gathered around a wooden cross, some with pointed hoods, some carrying rifles. We had stumbled onto a Ku Klux Klan meeting. They hadn't noticed us, and we were too scared to move. As soon as one of them turned our way, we bolted, racing home as fast as our bikes would go. When we told my friend's dad what we had seen, he didn't believe us at first, but he agreed to drive us back the next day so we could show him. When we got there, the clearing was empty, no benches, no cross. The only signs left were some carved markings on tree trunks and a few bullet casings scattered on the ground. I think my friend's dad called the police afterward, but we never found out what really happened there. Story 20, I was 14 years old and in the Boy Scouts when our troop took a 6-day canoeing trip down the Buffalo River in Arkansas. There were about 10 boys and 3 adults, and for days we hadn't seen anyone else. Each night we would paddle several miles and then camp wherever we found a flat spot along the riverbank. One night, a friend and I decided we were going to sleep in hammocks by the river instead of in the tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke up being eaten alive by mosquitoes and decided it was a terrible idea. I started walking back toward my tent. The field we were camping in was large, so the tents were spread far apart. As I passed one of the tents, I noticed a shape huddled beside it. I figured it was someone's backpack, but it looked odd, too big, too human-shaped. It was pitch black, so I couldn't really tell. For some reason, I decided to give it a little kick to see what it was. When I did, the shape grunted in pain. My heart stopped. We were in the middle of nowhere, and my first thought was that maybe Adam, the boy assigned to that tent, had stepped outside for some reason. I knelt down and whispered, "What are you doing out here?" The man replied, "I like you people." That was when pure terror hit me. This wasn't Adam. This was a stranger. I noticed a knife sheathed on his belt. Trying not to panic, I stayed calm, even though my mind was screaming at me to run. For some reason, I thought I should take the knife away from him, but before I could move, he grabbed my wrist and said, "You need to go to bed." I nodded quickly, said okay, and walked the 100 or so feet back to my tent, shaking the whole way. I woke up my tent mate, nearly hysterical, telling him what had happened. He thought I was imagining things and went outside to check, but when he came back, he said he didn't see anyone. The next morning, the adults called me over to talk. Gear was scattered everywhere, and one of the men's cameras was missing. They figured someone had gone through the campsites during the night, stealing from the packs. They searched the area for hours but never found a trace of anyone. It's still the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, And even now at 31, my wife laughs at me because I still sleep with a nightlight. Story 21. When I was about 5 years old, my dad decided to move our family from Maine to Texas. One snowy night, as we drove through Oklahoma, the storm got too heavy, so he pulled into a small roadside motel. For my older sister and me, it was an adventure. After unpacking, we went to explore. The man at the front desk was friendly, maybe around 60, and he introduced himself as Donald. He told us some stories I can't remember now, but he made us laugh. As we left, he handed me an apple and said, "Take a look at the pictures on the wall before you go." The next morning as we were checking out, I remembered what he said and stopped to look at the old black and white photos decorating the lobby. Most were of horse races from the early 1900s. One photo caught my attention. It showed 3 men standing in front of a racetrack. The man in the middle looked just like Donald. The caption read, "Donald, center." I called my sister over, and she immediately freaked out. We searched the lobby and even asked around, but he was nowhere to be found. The woman at the desk had no idea who we were talking about. She said she had been on duty all night, and no one named Donald worked there. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I'm not someone who believes easily in ghosts, but that night left me with a mystery that's never made sense. Story 22. I was home alone one night. I may have been in my late teens or early 20s. I lived with my parents for a while during and after college. Anyway, home alone. Our house was built on 3 wooded acres in a rural subdivision, meaning there were houses all around us, but each on its own 3-acre plot. I was at the kitchen table reading or something and had the windows open. It was a warm, cloudless summer night, and we did not have air conditioning. The moon was bright, and it was easy to see outside. I heard voices coming from the part of our property that was not wooded, but was a grass field. I looked out the window and saw 2 people talking to each other. They looked like they were about 100 feet away from the house. For some reason, this did not bother me, and I even decided to walk out and talk to them. It was not uncommon for my uncles to drop by unexpectedly, so I guessed one of them might have shown up with a cousin or something. Anyway, I grabbed a flashlight and set out to talk to them. As I approached, I was able to make out shapes more clearly, except instead of being 2 people talking to each other, it turned out to be just a half-deflated mylar balloon twisting in the breeze, the silver reflective side catching the moonlight as it spun. It was still inflated enough to bob, but not enough to float away. I stopped dead in my tracks when I realized it was a balloon and not 2 people. It was a very sudden realization, and it scared me. The voices I had heard were from a nearby summer camp. They were having an assembly and were using a loudspeaker, and the sound rolled over the hills so faintly that it had sounded like mumbling. Even though I could rationally piece together what was happening, I was shaken by that jolt of recognition when the 2 people became a mylar balloon. My brain had convinced me there were 2 people until my eyes fed it more information. And when I was close enough to tell, my perception flipped. It left me unnerved for the rest of the night. Story 23. In my old neighborhood, the creek that ran alongside many houses provided endless fun for kids my age. Fishing, swimming, tubing, canoeing, and general exploring. When I was about 13 or 14, a good friend and I were hanging out near the creek where the nearest access was down a steep wooded hill of about 60 or 70 feet from one of the main neighborhood roads. I remember it because we found a whole lot of fossils embedded in the rocks at the water's edge, trilobites, leaf imprints, and in previous years it was also where we had found large caches of adult magazines. We had not noticed that a kid about 3 or 4 years older than us had wandered down until he was roughly 40 feet away. We immediately recognized him as the quiet, tough-looking kid who always sat at the back of the bus. He walked over and silently stood staring. We asked what was up and that we recognized him, and then he suddenly punched my friend in the face and pinned him to a small tree by the neck. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and kept me from getting close. My friend managed to free himself, and the kid demanded cash or valuables. Realizing we were not rich pickings, he asked which of us would stay as a hostage, while the other went to get money. I volunteered, knowing my friend's mother and her partner were at home. My friend ran up the hill while I sat beside the kid, who stared across the creek and talked in a flat way about how easily he could kill me with a rock and hide me in the woods. He asked if my parents would be sad if I were dead, and said he hoped my friend would bring back something worthwhile. After maybe 15 to 20 minutes, my friend peeked over the guardrail and said he had what he could. The kid let me go and followed us up, and as soon as I reached the top, I ran to my friend's mother's car. Her partner, a big, athletic, blue-collar man, stepped in and confronted the kid. There was no fight, but he kept him there until the police arrived. We filed a report, and when officers spoke with the kid's parents, his mother apparently asked if her son could have the same parole officer as his father. It was a traumatic experience that pushed my friend and me to start lifting weights so we would feel more able to defend ourselves in the future. Story 24. When I was about 12 or 13, I was staying at my cousin's house, which sat in a fairly remote area surrounded by forest. I fell asleep in the front room, which faced the driveway, a long stretch of grass and concrete that sat far back from the road. Around 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly, already paralyzed with fear for reasons I couldn't explain. As I lay there, I heard heavy, slow footsteps right outside the window, just feet away from me. The couch I was on was pushed directly against the glass, so whatever it was stood right behind my head. The steps sounded like someone slowly marching in place, heavy and deliberate. I stayed frozen, listening for what felt like forever, before finally retreating into a bedroom and trying not to panic. I didn't tell anyone for years until recently, when my cousin told me she'd had a nearly identical experience in the small detached apartment next to the same driveway. Another time at that same house, we decided to go for a late-night swim in their pool. It was around 1 in the morning, and behind the pool was a huge patch of grass that stretched into the woods. I climbed onto the balcony beside the pool and was chatting with a cousin when I looked out toward the trees. Standing at the edge of the forest was a man, partially hidden by the branches. He was wearing black, but I could see his pale face and bare arms in the faint light. Fast forward to the house I live in now. It seems we've always had strange encounters. About 10 days ago, I woke around 4 in the morning to my dog barking in a way I had never heard before. Ferocious, panicked. As I was getting dressed to check outside, I suddenly heard a man yell, "Oh God, oh God!" followed by 2 sets of running footsteps. By the time I got outside, no one was there. Another time, my brother was in the end bedroom of the house, which faces the street and has windows low enough to climb through. His bed sat directly beneath one of them, and of course he had left it open. In the middle of the night, some man in a hood started climbing through the window, right over my brother's head. My brother, startled but bold, shouted at him to "Get out!" and the man ran off. We've had countless incidents like that, made worse by the fact that a man once murdered 2 people just down the street. And maybe all of that explains why my dreams can feel so terrifyingly real. Once, after a nightmare too vivid to describe, my mind slipped into another dream that convinced me I had woken up. I was lying in bed, sweating, when I heard voices outside my porch door and footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone opened the door and stood beside my bed. I felt the blanket lift, and that's when I truly woke up, except I didn't realize it at first. I was completely paralyzed, eyes wide open, praying that if I stayed still, nothing would happen. It took me nearly 20 minutes to calm down and convince myself it had only been a dream. Story 25. When I was 16, my family moved from a busy city to a secluded upscale town surrounded by thick woods. By law, each property had to occupy at least 2 acres, which meant our nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk away. Even our driveway stretched 5 minutes from the mailbox to the front door. It was peaceful, but eerily so. During the move, I found a plastic ball about the size of a basketball, half white and half violet, with the colors swirling together around the middle. Between unpacking boxes, I tried to get my dog, a small cockapoo named Crispy, to play with it. She was an affectionate little dog, always curious and protective of my sister and me, but for some reason she refused to go near the ball. I figured she'd warm up to it eventually and left it in my room. Over the next 3 days, Crispy started spending nearly all her time in my room, refusing to come downstairs even for food. It was strange. She usually loved being around people, especially when the whole family was together. When I checked on her one afternoon, she was lying on the floor, staring intently at the plastic ball. I laughed, assuming she was finally taking an interest in it. But when I stepped closer, she let out a low, steady growl. Startled, I backed away and left the room, chalking it up to some weird dog behavior. That night, when I came back to sleep, she was still in the same spot, watching the ball as if guarding it. I chuckled and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to Crispy barking wildly. My heart was pounding. She stood rigid, growling at the ball, which was now slowly rocking from side to side, as if something inside it was shifting. I assumed it was a draft from the open window, so I closed it, but the ball kept moving. Her barking turned frantic, those high-pitched, pleading barks dogs make when they're terrified. I walked over, pressed my foot against the ball to stop it, then scooped Crispy up and put her on my bed. Neither of us slept much after that. The next night I woke up again, same eerie feeling of dread, same sound of Crispy barking. The ball was rocking back and forth again, only this time every window was shut tight. My fear spiked. I grabbed Crispy and ran to my parents' room. My mom laughed, amused that her 16-year-old son, a football player no less, was afraid of a toy ball. I slept downstairs for the rest of the night. The following day, I decided I'd had enough. After football practice, I grabbed the ball, tossed it into my car with Crispy in my lap, and drove toward town. I chucked it out of the window and watched it roll into the ditch on the side of the road. Crispy seemed instantly calmer, curling up peacefully beside me. For the first time all week, I felt relieved. But the next evening when I got home, there it was, sitting in the middle of our living room floor. Crispy was back to staring at it. My sister said she and Dad had found it on the side of the road and thought it would make a good toy for Crispy. I was speechless. Fed up, I took it outside and punted it into the woods. For a few days, everything returned to normal. Crispy was her cheerful self again. Then one weekend night, I came home around 2 a.m. As I opened the garage door, something round caught the corner of my eye. The same plastic ball rolled slowly into view. Furious, I grabbed a kitchen knife, went outside and popped it before tossing it in the trash. Looking back, it was probably just a string of coincidences, but I've never been more unsettled in my life. And to this day, every time I walk past a bin full of shiny plastic balls at the store, I can't help but feel a little relieved that there are fewer of them around. Story 26. I am sure everyone, at least from my generation, heard rumors about satanic cults in their hometowns. For me, those stories were constant and especially intense around Halloween. My friends and I considered ourselves little investigators, like the Hardy Boys. We would ride our bikes all around town looking into any new rumor that spread. One day the town's fire sirens went off, which was huge news since it was such a small place. Almost every able-bodied man was part of the volunteer fire department, so we knew everyone would be gathering downtown. We didn't want to miss it, so we grabbed our bikes and rode to the fire hall. When we got there, we saw that the big garage door was still closed, and everyone was standing in a semicircle in front of it, whispering and shaking their heads. We pushed through the crowd and saw the town's meanest dog lying in the street, torn apart, still gasping for air. It was a huge Doberman, and now it was shredded and barely alive. One of the older men muttered that it must have been a badger attack, and somehow that explanation satisfied everyone. My friends and I, however, noticed a trail of blood leading away from the scene. Naturally, we decided to follow it. The bloody trail led us out of town to a fallow field. It was shocking that the dog had made it so far, and we soon lost the trail among the black clumps of soil. Nothing looked out of place except for one thing. The trail seemed to lead directly toward an old abandoned farmhouse that stood alone in the middle of the field. With evening coming fast, we decided we would come back the next day to explore. Our plan was delayed when one of the younger kids told his parents, and soon all of ours knew about it and forbade us from going anywhere near that house. We waited a few days until the weekend when the excitement had died down. We packed our flashlights, a few sticks, a small Swiss Army knife, and a coil of yellow rope before setting off down the dirt path that led to the field. The house was a weathered Victorian, missing most of its paint and with broken windows everywhere. Inside, we found stacks of old magazines and about 50 Dairy Queen cups piled behind a couch. In the kitchen were little mounds of feathers and tiny bones, along with a length of rope tied into a noose. Small tufts of down were still caught in the fibers. When we went down into the basement, we froze. There were several white sheets stained black with what looked like dried blood, and in one corner, a pile of animal skulls and bones. Along the far wall hung 6 dusty pelts that looked like they had come from cats, based on their markings. The pelts were ragged, torn unevenly, and blood had soaked into the floor beneath them. It was clear they hadn't been placed there for any normal reason. The air was heavy and foul, and we didn't stay long enough to investigate further. We sprinted back into the daylight and never told our parents what we found. For years afterward, we were convinced that some kind of deranged cult had used that farmhouse. And even now, thinking about it makes my stomach turn. Story 27. Not many creepy things happened in my house, but the few that did were enough to convince me that something was wrong with it. When my parents bought the place, it looked perfect. The rooms were spotless. The air smelled like fresh paint, and the garage floor was an unblemished shade of slate gray. The night after we moved in, I went out to the garage to grab a soda, and that was when I saw them. Baby-sized footprints spread across the floor. At first I thought maybe they were painted or scratched in, but when I bent down and touched them, the surface was completely smooth. The shapes were sealed into the concrete, as if trapped inside. My dad said we must have missed them when we first checked out the house, but my mom and I swore they weren't there before. A few days later, something far worse happened. I had decided to take a nap in the guest room because it had a big, soft bed. Our parrot Sammy liked to hang out there too. He would sit quietly on top of his cage most of the time. I was half asleep when I suddenly felt a freezing gust of air blow across my face. I opened my eyes and saw a man running straight toward me, gripping a towel stretched tightly between his hands like he was about to strangle me. I shot up, my heart hammering, drenched in sweat. At that exact moment, Sammy started flying around the room, screeching at the top of his lungs. I bolted out of the room and didn't go back for hours. When I finally returned, Sammy was panting and bug-eyed. I never slept in that room again, and to this day, Sammy still freaks out randomly. About a week later, my mom saw the same man. She was cleaning the kitchen, which connected to the dining room where the back door led to the deck. She looked out the window and saw a man standing on the deck, staring blankly into the distance. She yelled, "Why, hey!" But he didn't react or even move. She ran outside, but there was no one there. Then almost immediately, every dog in the neighborhood started barking all at once. The final thing that happened was the smallest but also the most convincing. One night in the middle of winter, I went outside onto the deck for some reason I can't even remember now. There was fresh snow everywhere, untouched, except for a trail of baby-sized footprints scattered across the deck. There were no tracks leading to or away from them. I just froze, staring, before turning around and running back inside. That was the moment I finally accepted that there was something in that house, something small, restless, and maybe still wandering those halls long after it was gone. Story 28. When I was about 14 or 15, I spent the night at my best friend's house, which was right across the street from mine. It was summertime, and her older brother and sister had a bunch of friends over, so the house was full of people hanging out. Around 3 in the morning, my friend and I decided to take a walk because it was a warm, peaceful night. We felt safe. It was our own neighborhood after all. We walked about 10 blocks away when we noticed a man following us. We turned a corner and hid in some bushes in front of a house, hoping he'd pass by. Unfortunately, he must have seen us because he came straight toward our hiding spot. We bolted. My friend was on the track team and could run way faster than I could, so she took off ahead of me. I tried to hide again, but the man saw me, grabbed my arm, and pulled me out of the hedge. He said he was a police officer and started walking me down the street, holding on to me tightly. I kept asking him to show me his badge, but he never did. He just kept walking and insisting I go with him. What he didn't realize was that he was walking straight toward our houses. When we were about 2 blocks away, a group of teenagers came running toward us, my friend's siblings and all their friends. They surrounded the man, yelling at him to let me go and asking if I was okay. They were ready to beat him up if he tried anything. He hadn't physically hurt me, just scared me senseless, so I told them to let him go. He took off into the night, and we never saw him again. I'll never know what his true intentions were, but I've always believed I dodged something truly awful that night. Later, my friend told me that when she first ran home and told everyone what was happening, They didn't believe her until she broke down crying. That's when they all ran out to find me. To this day, I still get chills thinking about what could have happened if they hadn't shown up when they did.